top. We are live, everybody. CK, you want to take it away?
What is up, everyone? This is CK. I am with Bitcoin Magazine, and you are watching Drinks in Quarantine. This is our fourth ever mining mastermind. This is where we bring the best minds in mining together to talk about what is happening in Bitcoin mining and give you really anything from an informative conversation to an absolutely cosmic conversation. I found that these mining conversations often are some of the most entertaining and wide-ranging conversations. So always exciting to bring it on. Again, this is Drinks in Quarantine, so we encourage everyone to grab a drink. We're gonna have some drinking rules, but before we get into it, a miner and a fantastic Bitcoiner yesterday passed away. Matt D'Souza, a fantastic Bitcoiner and someone who has really innovated in thought about the Bitcoin mining space and did a lot of education in really his final months on Earth. So just want to give us a moment of silence for Matt and in his remember him as a great Bitcoiner and someone who's really contributed a lot to this space.
Okay. All right, CK, you want to move on and we'll go into the rules.
Yep. All right. So, like I said, we have a fantastic panel here. I want to start with the person to my right. Let's start with Kristy. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell the audience what you do in this space?
Yep, Kristy-Leigh Minahan. Most people know me by my handle as Oh Got a Girl. I currently run a technology consulting company that primarily deals in blockchain called Oh Got a Company. We serve, we do advisory and consulting services for most of the mining farms spanning North America and Europe. And we also do a lot of blockchain analysis. Folks mostly know me probably from my nonce analysis work, among other things.
Awesome. And let's go to the person on my right, Alex Holmes, calling in from the OpenNode office. What's up, Alex?
What's up, guys? My name's Alex Holmes. My background is in sports and entertainment. So I'm a local guy from LA. I went to USC, played football, played in the NFL for a little bit. Have primarily worked in the celebrity space for the last 10 years, but my passion is Bitcoin. I got into mining by accident in 2017 and just became enthralled with it, and so have expanded a couple mining operations domestically and in China. And I also spend a lot of time working with the OpenNode guys.
Awesome. And let's go to our newest entrance, Jesse. How's it going? You got your audio working?
How's it going, man?
All right, awesome. Jesse Pelton, why don't you introduce yourself and tell the audience what you do in the mining space?
So my name is Jesse Pelton. I'm CTO of Huddle Ranch, and we're a company focused on moving hash rate to Texas.
Awesome. Short and sweet. Let's go over to Elsa, who's actually in the future. She's calling in from China and on Friday morning. Elsa, why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay, hi. Thanks for having me here. I'm Elsa, and I joined the mining industry 3 years ago, and I worked as marketing manager of MicroBT, which is the manufacturer of Westminer. Thank you.
Awesome, and we are not strange to What's-Miner. We've talked about What's-Miner a lot on this show. It is very having quite the year here. So excited to have you as kind of formal representation. Last is Leo Zhang calling in from New York. How's it going, man? Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Hey guys, I'm Leo. I'm the founder of Financial Research. So this is a research publication that's dedicated to the hash power industry. So before I started this, I was with a New York-based crypto fund that specializes in mining. I was the director of research there, and I was heading the mining operations. So I did that for the past 3 years and realized there's still a lot of potential to educate people, especially on just what the hell is going on within the mining space. So I left the company in May and started Anisha.
Awesome. Well, congratulations on founding that. And again, welcome to the show. So like I said, this is Drinks in Quarantine. We have a few drinking rules. We set some words that are like the forbidden words. And if you say them, you have to take a drink. It's casual, it's fun, don't feel any pressure to drink, but definitely like to keep the drinks flowing in order to keep the conversation rolling. But let's move on to our next topic, the first topic, which is what is the current state of mining? A lot has happened in the last few months between the halvings, between flooding in China, between announcements of major investment in the United States. The mining industry is never really stagnant, but there seems to be really just pockets of information, and it's kind of hard to tap it. So I figured that you guys know best, and it'd be good to get a refresh from chatting with y'all. Let's start with Kristy. For you, what is the state of mining today?
It is the time of institutions, man. 2020 is all about institutions. We have DCG's Foundry that's just rolled up. We're having more and more entities like Core Scientific, Layer 1, Northern Data that are coming in with these big investments solely dedicated to Bitcoin mining. And all of these institutions are looking at, alternate ways to treat Bitcoin mining not just as, you know, consistent revenue generation, but layer one is playing around with the concept of the Bitcoin battery, where they're actually an energy provider on the ERCOT grid. So it is, you know, it's the time of institutions. This is what we dreamed about back in 2010, you know, Bitcoin mining eventually becoming. So it's pretty exciting.
So institutional mining is coming. Let's go to the opposite end of the spectrum. Alex, you're kind of running, probably not an institutional mining operation. Can you kind of talk about what's the state of mining for you?
Yeah, for me, the last few weeks really has been tough. Domestically, you know, I've kind of stopped moving machines into the United States just because of the tariff situation. It's been tough. And I'm getting better rates in China. So I have two mining operations in China. The one in Sichuan was down for about 10 days, which was a bummer from the mining. But Yunnan province has been fine. You know, I'm certainly not anywhere close to institutional level, but I'd like to think that my little piece of the mining world is growing as often as possible. But definitely with the flooding has been pretty crazy. And, you know, I really feel bad for those guys because they send me videos on WeChat. It's crazy how bad it is.
Give us an idea, a visual of what you're seeing.
Can I just show you on my phone?
I mean, it might be easier to describe it, but maybe while you're figuring it out, let's jump to Elsa, who might be a little bit more intimate to what's happening in China. What's the state of mining from your perspective, Elsa?
Yeah, it is.
It's a ripper.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, so maybe the past for the last 2 weeks, we see that the hash rate of total network, it has dropped like 20 E, I guess, at that time. So because of the flooding, but we also see them some videos about that there's some flooding and buried mining farms. But actually, that is quite small. It's a pretty small possibilities for that. But most of the mining farms did have influenced a lot in Sichuan because of their internet was cut because of the flooding. Yeah. So, but it can be resumed very soon. So that's why you could see that the hash rates just increase again because they have fixed the network. Yeah.
Gotcha. So it wasn't like farms getting flooded, but rather like infrastructure, like the internet went down, and that affected the hash rate. Got it. That makes sense. So Steve just rejoined the call. Steve, why don't you introduce yourself, and then you can jump straight into what is the state of mining today from your perspective of the mining world?
Yeah, my phone, I'm still on cellular, but I was outside. My phone just blew up, so I had to come inside. Yeah, my name's Steve. I am the owner of Upstream Data. We just do oil field mining and build data centers and that kind of thing. So what is the state of mining today? Very difficult, extremely difficult. I don't know, revenues are not as exciting as they've been in the past per kilowatt hour, but you know, there's a lot of innovation going on. And I think those of us who can get through these difficult times will be well positioned as, you know, things pick up. So.
Okay. Let's go to Leo. I mean, I know you spend a lot of time like researching what's happening in mining. What's the current state of mining today?
Yeah, so the short-term news, I think everyone's aware. The flooding in China, that's pretty exciting. There are some new machines coming out, or rumors about new machines coming out, and I think a longer-term trend, I think, is more significant in the past couple months. That's developing is the connection between the mining industry as well as the finance industry. We're seeing more institutions, more companies that are willing to lend to miners using machines or coins as collaterals. in my personal experience, just even 6 months ago, it was very difficult to get, to get loans with machines as machines themselves as collateral. Most lenders would want a piece of your land, or the equity of the facility itself. So I think more financial institutions are more are open to this kind of collaborations, and more innovative type of structured products are happening with between pools and exchanges. I think we're going to see more liquidity providers try to get in front of miners more directly. I think we'll see some of the more products that try to some extent virtualizes hash rate. Yeah, but overall, I think a big trend is the development of hash power capital markets.
Yeah, that's something that Ethan Vera and the guys from why am I blanking out on the mining pool?
Luxor.
Yeah, on Luxor pool. They talk about that a lot. Jesse, why don't you jump in here from your perspective? What's the state of mining today?
I think Kristy hit it on the head with it's institutional. We're seeing a transition from mining being sort of on a smaller scale to being hyperscale. I mean, it's the same sort of trend that you're seeing in the traditional data center industry, where you get a lot of economies of scale for going bigger. And in mining, that's just as true, if not more so.
Gotcha. I mean, anyone else want to comment on what's being said? Is it really just like, I mean, I guess we could talk about the DCG news here. Any comments on that announcement, and what does that mean for mining in North America?
So as someone who worked with Mike Coyer, I'm incredibly excited for what he has been working on in the pipelines. Foundry has already funded quite a large amount of the mining equipment in North America. They're already working with a lot of mining pools. They've been building this in stealth for close to a year. I think it's closer to 9 months, actually. I think what this is going to offer is, anyone who is curious about mining can work with, through the network of the DCG companies. They can work with they can work with Grayscale to put over some of their investment into mining. They can get curious with the staking. They can get access to DeFi exposure. And, if they have any concerns about where to get mining equipment, which provider to host with, Foundry is building themselves up to be this one turnkey solution targeted specifically for institutions. That is exciting. It's a great way to scale Bitcoin and get people who have long-term commitments in mind with the network. So I'm excited for that.
Is this bad for Bitcoin, that it's just going to be institutions and all this money pouring in?
At some point, so the thing with proof of work networks is at some point it turns from home mining to more of the institutional investors. As long as they are sufficiently distributed, so they're not all just clustered in North Carolina or on the one energy grid, you're still getting access to your decentralization. And institutional investors are not going to go and perform 51% attacks. They're not going to do hostile takeovers. They are not going to do anything that harms their own investment. If anything, institutional investors are incredibly logical and a lot easier to work with, as opposed to, some of the scrappier home mining operations that, might have their own agenda. So I don't think this is bad for Bitcoin at all. I think it's really good for Bitcoin. I have just said Bitcoin so many times, I don't even remember if we went through the rules. So
yeah, I just remembered that we didn't go through the rules, and in the chat, Leo suggested that we add institutional as one of our drinking words. So let's go back to the rules on the screen, and then we can go over those really quick.
We're back.
Well, I think
Where do you set up mines?
Go ahead.
Wait, go for it.
I was just asking Steve where he sets up mines.
Oh, where I set up mines?
Mm-hmm.
Mostly oil fields. So anywhere where there's basically economically stranded natural gas. So commonly like vent sources. So natural gas that they're venting out of the wellhead.
Mm-hmm.
and they do that. They're allowed to do that in up to certain volumes, but now there's like carbon penalties on a lot of that for methane emissions. So we go after that. I sort of call it, I call it liability gas, like gas that, you know, they need to spend money to dispose of. So it already represents a liability to them. So in terms of like geographically, we got about 40 deployments right now. They're all relatively small scale. Like they're not all like, they're not megawatt size usually in scope, but most of them are Canada, but we got them in Texas, Michigan, hopefully North Dakota right away. New York State, I shipped one to New York State about 3 weeks ago. A couple other states. So,
what is the effective rate end up being?
Sorry?
What does the effective rate end up being?
The rate, like the kilowatt, like the load?
Yeah. Yep.
We build like in-house, we build like 50 kilowatt gensets. And I know that sounds small, but it just happens to be like a commodity engine. So it's like cost per kilowatt. It's the right solution for these guys. Our stuff is up to like 400. Usually each site is anywhere between 50 and 400 kilowatt. But most of them are, a lot of them, like our customers are oil and gas producers. Before they want to like invest in something large scale, they want to try something small and see how it works, see if this Bitcoin money is real. Like, you know, like sort of, it's just a way for them to trial it and dip their toes. So they usually go for like the smaller units first. So we have a lot of customers that are big oil companies, but they've only bought like either they supplied a small genset and we supplied the data center, or they bought like a small data center. I wanted to comment before we move on. I would comment on like the, you know, we're definitely, you know, obviously institutional, and I guess I got a drink, but I'll drink after I speak. Institutional miners are obviously a big deal now, and that is where it's trending. I feel, I don't know what you guys think. Maybe this is something we can talk about later, but I think this is a necessary phase of Bitcoin's growth, I guess. Like, you know, I would almost consider the early phase, like the first decade was almost the discovery phase. It was before hardware was commoditized, before like, you know, all the low hanging fruit energy sources are like slowly getting picked off. I wonder in the future, like at least my hypothesis is that in the future, institutions will still be a big player because they'll always have the economies of scale, they'll always have the capital, the resources. But, you know, as it gets more competitive and as like, you know, we play that arbitrage where there's not that many more, you know, really low hanging fruit in terms of electricity sources, as like, let's say in China, where obviously a lot of mining is happening, you know, it becomes more competitive for the power and the price of power goes up. I wonder if it will sort of split off and sort of these big institutions will splinter into smaller, you know, they'll fracture, I guess, into smaller businesses. That's something I sort of think will happen, but, you know, speculative. So.
I like to have some comment about it. So I think this year compared to last year is a little different about mining because I see that the new money is going into the mining from out of China. So especially for the North America, which I think is a high potential mining market from this year, I think. And DCG is actually a giant of the in this mining industry. And actually, MicroBT has been working with DCG for a while now, and we are happy to be partnered with them. Yeah.
And Blockstream.
Yeah, yeah.
I never see much about Blockstream in the news anymore. I'm very disappointed. I want more releases about Blockstream, more news.
They've had not good news. They were giving Samson a hard time. The Twitter mob.
Everyone gives Samson a hard time.
Yeah, so I want to follow up on that. I think I think the industrialization and centralization of mining has always been, behind people's. It's always been a thing that that people struggle with, especially some market commentators who are not directly involved in the industry. I think just given how any physical production based commodity, this kind of centralization centralization in terms of operation is inevitable, right? Hardware is just much easier to manage when you have everything in one place. And I think what's going to become interesting is as fees converge to 100% of mining revenue, and institutions become, whether it's large institutions or smaller institutions consist of many smaller miners, they're going to have much more variables when it comes to predicting mining revenue. So does it mean that only larger institutions that have a bigger pocket will be able to weather the kind of uncertainty, or there will be more tools that help mining companies to offset some of their risks, or in the form of packaging up their hash rate and sell it to a popular market, or in some way that's more advanced, or to be UDA's hash rate forwards, so that the actual physical operation that produces hash, and the people who actually receive the economic produce from the hash rate are two different groups of people. So I think that's going to be the divergence where it starts to become interesting. So I personally think the second trend is going to happen more likely, where there's much better financial infrastructure that help large single miners that transact or issue their hash rate, whatever you call it.
So I have a question. Is anyone here worried about the owners of hash rate to kind of becoming apathetic towards who uses that hash rate and for what? Because that seems to be a level of fear or even like FUD that is kind of spread around, that with these kind of like hash rate markets, that all of a sudden people are just selling their hash rate on these hash rate marketplaces, and the Bitcoin network can be bought to the highest bidder, and maybe that person doesn't actually care about the network. Is that like a realistic fear at all?
So I think I think this is a pretty nuanced argument. There are several layers here. One, the kind of hash rate market that we are discussing, we need to make a distinction that whether the buyer of the hash rate can actually vote on the chain, right? So if we're just talking about hash rate forwards, where it's just simply a financial swap where it's just USD versus Bitcoin, then the voting right of that hash rate is still with the producer of the hash rate. So in that case, the ownership of the voting is still in one place. But if, let's say, we have a far more advanced, much larger NiceHash style market where the buyers can actually determine which chain the hash rate is going to be building on, then I think then it becomes an economics question, that whether it's even profitable for the producer of the hash rate to sell it on the open market versus just to have that hash rate to himself. But overall, I think this is fair game. I think this is just part of the hash rate Darwinism that's designed in the first place.
I think this is potentially more of an issue with GPUs than it is with ASICs, where if you're mining with a GPU, you don't necessarily have any sort of allegiance to any specific chain. You can mine any GPU chain, and if some chain gets attacked and the value goes down, it doesn't really affect your bottom line. I think that is less so the case when you're talking about ASICs. Like if you're SHA-256, your future revenue, the value of all your machines, of all your hardware, is dependent on the future value of that network. So I think there's a slightly different dynamic there. I don't know if that necessarily means that one is open to attacks and the other isn't, but I do think that there's a distinction on ASIC versus GPU there.
I'd push back on that a lot, simply because when you look at the Ethereum chain, for instance, the GPU is the ASIC. So GPUs are dependent on the security of Ethereum in exactly the same way that SHA-256 ASICs are dependent on Bitcoin. It's all just about scale. If you abstract away the hardware and the algorithm, at the end of the day, it's all about scale. mining, for it to be a steady source of revenue and for it to be secure, it's just, you've got to have enough participants. And this is why chains like Ethereum Classic get 51% attacked.
I, I think you're right about the relative dominance piece of like, if you have GPUs and there's, if for Ethereum, for example, is worth the vast majority of the hash rate on GPUs. And similarly, like if you like, I don't think there's much of a barrier to not attack low hash rate SHA-256 coins if you have SHA-256 ASICs. But I think that in either case, you're not incentivized to attack the largest chain. It's just that in terms of GPU, like in terms of any specific mining hardware, whether it's a SHA-256 ASIC or you've got a script ASIC or you've got GPUs, there really can only be one stable large coin.
Yeah, but in the case of Bitcoin, there are 3 stable large coins. I know that's politically debatable, but there are 3 chains that'll have their interesting dynamics. And amusingly, they haven't, those 3 chains haven't been 51% attacked. Usually the 51%, this is something I've been doing a ton of research on actually. So like absolutely obsessing over the reasons why the 51% attacks happen. And oftentimes it comes down to what we found is that someone was trying to test out, could they still perform a shadow mining attack in the case of Bitcoin Gold or in the case of Ethereum Classic. And, oftentimes it's actually we've found that it's actually a participant that's already been in the ecosystem that just sees an opportunity. But that's really rare. Most miners want to be a good steward. You get this for, if you look at all of the different GPU mineable coins, how many of them have actually been 51% attacked? Only 3 out of what's our sample size? 325 right now? Right now? Like 3 out of 325 is pretty damn good.
The question, the question he said, like, just to distinguish something, he said hash rate rental. So in this context, I guess it doesn't matter if we're talking about GPUs or ASICs, because we're talking about people renting hash rate. And, if you're selling your hash rate to a rental agency, I guess, Jesse, you're concerned there about, at the capital loss, like the value loss in the specific equipment isn't relevant because we're talking about rentals, right?
I think it still is, because the question is, if that is a potential thing that can happen when you rent a hash rate, are you going to rent? Like if you're a large institution and you've got hundreds of megawatts of mining and you could potentially get 1/10% or 0.5% more revenue doing a hash rate rental, but then there's this sort of existential risk to your business, are you going to do that? And I think that, maybe your average sort of retail miner might still participate in a hash rate rental, but I think that that's something that's going to be a barrier for a lot of larger groups.
Wouldn't an institution put KYC checks in place? I mean, I know from, my days working with some of the bigger companies, we need to KYC every single customer, rental or not. And even in the case of some of my clients that do offer hash rate rentals for, VC funds, etc., KYC checks are always in place. We need to understand the customer. It's one of the big things that most of the North American operations require as well for the auditors. We need to understand, where we're getting money from. So do you not see that being, a common trend when we're talking about hash rate rentals?
No, I definitely think that you're going to see, if at the larger scale, people are going to require KYC. I totally agree with that.
And I think if someone executed a 51% attack on Bitcoin through a rental contract, anyone selling those rental contracts might, think twice about doing it again. I don't know if it could happen. I think it could happen. It probably will happen eventually, but I think the damage is naturally limited.
Mm-hmm. There's a really good paper that I stumbled upon by the Royal Bank of Canada that I encourage everyone to take a read of. It's Why Fixed Costs Matter for Proof of Work Currencies. And so the Royal Bank of Canada and the University of California, they collaborated on this paper to basically do an assessment on defining the security for proof of work, because no one's quite defined it in financial terms. And they came up with some fantastic algorithms, and I quite agree with their thesis. And, part of their reasoning is it's not just fixed costs on the hardware. It's ensuring that costs are always predictable. So you're not going to have large fluctuations like we've had with the S9, whereas some folks can get them for $1,300 and then the next day, you know, it drops down to $200. But it's also fixed costs to some degree around the electricity. And I feel like once we start getting the scale that we're seeing here in Bitcoin, chains become a lot more secure because there is only so many ways you can squeeze out pricing on the electricity side. You know, the utility companies have a floor. So something I'll throw out there for everyone to read. I found it absolutely fascinating. Even more fascinating that the Bank of Canada wrote a paper about proof of work cryptocurrencies.
They're getting into it. They can't help it.
Everyone's obsessed, man. Like it's insane.
Is a mind virus. No matter what you do, you can't avoid it at this point. Anyone else want to weigh in on this? All right, guys, let's jump to the rules. We've gone far too long without any penalties. So we have 3 rules planned. They were, you can't say CapEx or OpEx, you can't say Bitcoin, can't say drink. But I think I'm gonna audible and can't say institutional instead of CapEx, OpEx. I think that's gonna be a lot more effective. So let's go with that. So can't say institutional, can't say Bitcoin, can't say drink, and I'll drink triple for that.
And can't say institutions too, I'd say. Just the whole word.
Businesses.
There you go. There's always a way around the rules.
Yep. All right. So I think that this is a really interesting question, and there's probably a really nuanced answer, and I'm excited to hear what you guys think of it. But, you know, where are the biggest opportunities for hash rate to grow? You know, we're seeing a lot of a wide variety of different kind of Bitcoin mining operations. And I'm kind of curious, like, you know, where is the most of the hash going to come from? I mean, let's jump to Jesse on this one. I know a lot of people are extremely bullish on Texas, and I know that that's what you guys are all about. You know, where's hash rate going to come in the next few years?
I mean, obviously, I think that Texas is going to be a big region. I think that you know, the Texas electricity market is enormous. It's an 80,000 megawatt market. Like, you could fit all of Bitcoin in less than 10% of the Texas electricity market. But I think that in order for Bitcoin to be really healthy on a global scale, we're going to need to have hash rate built out in more than just one place. I think the trends that we're seeing with hash rate moving out of China and being less concentrated, I think that's incredibly bullish for Bitcoin. But I think that it's going to take more than just one place to really have a globally distributed network that investors can be comfortable investing in. Like, the value proposition of Bitcoin is the fact that you can move value without a central authority, and centralization is a huge risk to that. So I think it's moving in the right direction. I think Texas is going to be a big part of it. I hope that Canada steps in a bigger way. I wish that Europe could be a part of that, but it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. But I think that there are several regions around the world that are going to have to expand in order to really reach that sort of global scale.
Who wants to jump in?
Did anyone count how many times, Jesse, you need to consume alcohol? From that.
Well done, Leo. Proud of you. What are your thoughts here, Leo?
Well, I heard the B word at least 3 times, I think.
Shots.
Jesse, get on a knee and just chug. Let's go.
Well, so
Yeah, anyways, sorry.
yeah, I was just going to jump in and say, you know, we're talking about the growth of hash rate, and maybe to help kind of explain the question even further, there's multiple ways that it grows, right? There's new sources of power. There's new countries that are kind of investing into it. There's new rigs and you know, different products that you can use in order to create more hash power. And then there's like a whole financial side of it, the financialization of it. So there's a lot of ways that this question can go. And I'm obviously not an expert enough to talk about any of those, but just wanted to kind of repose it. And Leo, if you want to jump in, feel free.
Yeah, so I think obviously we're seeing the trend that more hash rate is moving out of China, moving to parts of Russia, parts of North America. I think that trend is very clear. So aside from geographic movements, I also want to comment on there are also other parts of the infrastructure stack are also happening as well. I think a big thing that traditional investor family offices, just from my personal experience of pitching mining investments to these people, a common reaction they have is, okay, 100% return sounds great, but what we really want is a consistent 5% return every year, and there's just no way to guarantee that, right? So I think many other traditional commodities that oil producers or precious metal producers, they have found very effective ways to hedge against their production risk, either on OTC markets or public markets using futures. I think that's going to be an important trend for hash power market to develop in order for other more traditional, more conservative investors to feel comfortable with the kind of volatility in return. I think what's going to be interesting is as fees become more dominant part of mining revenue, we require more interesting ways to manage that. One thing I'm seeing in the Ethereum mining space is that people realize, okay, the miners are leaving a lot of money on the table. There are more some interesting ideas being proposed, such as ways to prioritize certain transactions, certain ways to basically move the burden of gas costs from one side of people to other side of people. I think there will be more these kind of more nuanced toolkits that people start to build that fits into the mining infrastructure stack that make this process more efficient. I think that's going to be also a big part that growth is going to happen.
So it's coming from efficiency gains and kind of like incorporation. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think what Jesse and Steve are doing from a North American perspective has to be the future for mining, right? I think that, until our country figures out what we're going to do with the tariffs, maybe you guys have a way to get these machines in and not pay tariffs, but to me, it's just ridiculous to add, an extra 25% on an item, right? And then to try and play that game.
There's a good premium for smuggling right now, eh?
Exactly, right? So it's like, if I have a couple megawatts and I'm paying 3.5 cents in China, why do I want to bring in a $3,000 machine and pay an extra 25%? Until we get that figured out, that to me it's insane, right?
So, hey, I'm sorry, Kristy, before you jump in, I want to give Elsa a chance to chime in too. Coming from a manufacturer trying to ship machines around the globe, what's the landscape like there, and how does that affect where you're seeing opportunities to grow?
Okay, thank you. So I think the growth of the hash rate will be decided by the either existing machines now, or because these machines they're running with very low power cost. For example, you can see the still many machines, and they are running in China during the wet season. Even their profit is only $2 but they're still running because they're making profit. And so this is one part. And the other side, I think, is definitely coming from the new machines. But I think the supply capacity of the new machines is limited. This is the choice even for all the manufacturers, because the wafer foundries and their supply is limited because there's a huge demand of the some phones and PCs and their consumer electronics, and also the 5G communications. So the wafer foundry is totally limited, especially this mining industry is still quite small for them. So there must be a limited supply of the machines. So for this year, just like I said before, that I see the high potential market in North America, because more customers in North America, they would like to choose the machines with higher efficiency. So that might be the future. Yeah.
Okay, Kristy, sorry to interrupt you there. Why don't you jump in?
No, Elsa made a really good point. I'll pose a question to you guys. Since mining machines are so scarce, they're a really scarce resource. This is more of a terrifying future in my mind. what happens if a business decides to procure all of the ASIC machines from all of the manufacturers and just sits on them and jacks the price up that way? We've seen this,
That's
this
what's happening
happen
now.
to some degree. Riot Blockchain got their hands on a pretty decent set of machines at a competitive price. Foundry is getting, competitive machines. I do think it's harder for smaller miners to get access to cheap machines, because what's happening is the brokers are sucking up the supply, right? And then flipping it to the smaller miners. But that is, I've had some investors that have said, why don't we just buy all of the machines, raise together $100 million fund and acquire all of the machines and then flip them for a 30-50% premium. And this was something that happened in 2017 with the memory supply, and it affected not just Ethereum mining, it affected a lot of other areas. And it happened in 2019 with transistor supplies, and it affected quite a lot of the traditional computing space. So also
like all the
brings
people
up,
on eBay and Amazon in 2017, buying everything up and then just reselling it.
Or toilet paper in 2020.
There's always something. Yeah. So Steve, I know you kind of like you like build machines and kind of scrap ASICs together and like buy stuff used. Like what are you seeing from that perspective? Are ASICs that scarce? What's happening in the market for S9s? Like what's happening there?
Yeah, man, I'm still only buying S9s. I've been looking recently at prices. Like I just finished deploying another batch, so I've been looking at getting another batch. But now I'm seeing like my usual, Telegram like suppliers, those sketchy guys. They're
Nick from Kaboom Rap
jack right up for some reason now. Like I'm seeing the prices up. Like I was getting them at $30 a pop, like even a couple weeks ago, and then I'm looking like today, just seeing what the prices are like, and most of the sellers I'm seeing, at least publicly, saying is like $50. I'm like, well, what happened in that time? And I mean, yeah, price pumped a little, but like not that much since like I bought last time. So I am starting to wonder if these things are going to become more scarce. I don't know what people have been doing with their S9s at like Riot, for example. I know Riot was selling a lot of S9s, and I was talking to them, but like I'm still, I guess, small enough that I'm not buying enough from them. So they ended up offloading it somewhere else. But I don't know where they're going, and maybe someone's like, I mean, I'm not one to like, I never buy a machine unless I have a place to deploy it. Like it's a depreciating asset, so I just generally try not to sit on it. But somebody's still running a lot of them, so I'm not sure where they're going.
A ton went to China. Almost 45% of the S9 supply went to China. Really fun research project you can do. If you look at the nonce analysis that Coinmetrics did, a nonce analysis for S9s, so we can fingerprint them through the chain pretty easily. If you look at a snapshot of F2 pool, DX pool, and BTC.com, and most of the the Chinese run pools, you can see the S9 increase from 2019 up until July 2020, and you can correlate that with the difficulty increase. So I can say from personal experience, a bunch migrated from North America to China. Some went to Kazakhstan, some went to Iran, some went to places in Russia and Georgia as well. Just wherever there's sub 3.5 cent electricity. Yeah. And also to Upstream Data and other companies that are taking advantage of natural gas, because they're the perfect machine for that. They're durable. They're pretty hardy. So not too many issues.
Yeah, I think it's because of the lower power cost in China. I mean, especially the wet season.
Yeah, I wonder what's going to happen when the wet season ends. Like, will they all come back to where will they go? Oh. Hopefully not in a scrap pile. Send them to me. Okay, I'll hold on.
I think. So, go ahead, Elsa.
I'm sorry. I think the wet season will be ended at the end of October this year. So I'm not sure if the Bitcoin price can be increased to make that the old S9 to still making profit. Maybe that the hash rate will be the totally drop. I guess. Yeah. data aside Bitcoin.
Where's the most logical place for those S9s to go? If they're in China, finding the cheapest possible, is it Siberia?
I don't know. I heard that some like partners told me, some friend told me that they're recycling the used miners. So there's a kind of business for them, and also they just resell like used miners. Yeah, they told me that they just get some valuable parts of it. But I'm not sure about that. Yeah, I just keep watching it.
I can tell you there's a big market for the actual casing of an S9.
Yeah.
In the FPGA world, there's quite a few folks that are stripping out old LTC miners and old S9 miners just for the casing, and they send off the boards to to be put into an immersion rig, if that is still profitable. Otherwise, they dump them and they just want the casing. So that is an interesting and weird business, and lots of creative stuff is happening with the ASIC case.
You know, so here, and tell me what you guys think about this statement, but I just find a stark contrast between how I think about my iPhone and how miners think about ASICs. And I feel like the fiat system creates hardware that is constantly being planned, like there's planned obsolescence. The whole point of it is to sell you more hardware. And when it comes to Bitcoin, like, and mining in general, like, no hash rate is wasted. Like, the Bitcoin network is going to squeeze every last drop of utility out of that piece of hardware possible. And I think that is like bullish for humanity. Like, this is what we need to stop like destroying the world and use our resources better. What do you guys think of that?
I don't think that semiconductor manufacturing is dangerous for any of us. I think that any amount of semiconductor manufacturing increase is good for the world. So I think upgrade cycles on phones are good. I think it's good for ASICs too. I think that, you know, silicon is one of the most abundant elements in the Earth's crust, like silicon and oxygen. So if we're using more of it, it's a good thing.
I'm not talking even about producing it. I'm just saying like not wasting it. Cause like I have like 4 iPhones there in my closet.
Yeah, I feel like it's a different demand of the miners in China and miners out of China, because miners in China, and they have like the lower power cost during the wet season. So they are looking for the miners with economy. So I think that's why they're still like running S9 because they are still making profit. Even it's very slight profit, but it's still profit for them.
Who wants to jump in? We don't like silences here on the show.
Well, I guess like I think there's further improvement to make. Like we were just talking about reusing casings. Like, you know, in a lot of industries, you know, we standardize certain components, like just so, you know, you don't have one-off components on every screw is not like a different thread, right? It'd be nice. Like I think we're getting there. Like I'd say maybe in the next cycle or two, maybe we'll get there where everyone's like form factor is relatively the same, and you can just reutilize casings, reutilize fans, and the only thing you swap out is the hash boards. Like that to me is a logical progression, but I don't know if it'll ever happen. It depends on how competition is. Like someone's got to make an incentive for that to happen. Like someone's got to almost like build a hash board, like a modern hash board that fits like an S9 casing or something, like, and profit greatly off doing that. And I think that's the only way that'll happen. But you know, there's still room for improvement. But
I think that there is incentive for something like that to happen, but I wouldn't expect it to happen quickly. The vast majority of the costs of an ASIC machine are going to be the actual chips themselves. The aluminum extrusion for the casing and the fans and even the power supply are relatively little in terms of resources relative to the cost of the ASIC chips themselves. I think we're still seeing evolution in ASIC design. Like the form factor difference between going with a single 120 millimeter fan to two 120s or a 140, that was a big difference. You're going from a 1400 watt server all the way up to a 3000 or 3500 watt server. I think that's a huge difference. I think we're still going to see evolution in terms of heatsink design, in terms of like one thing that I really like about MicroBT is their exhaust temperatures are a lot higher. So that allows you to not have to move as much air to get the same cooling effect. So you've got essentially you're exhausting hotter air. You've got a bigger temperature differential between your intake and your exhaust. I think that can still continue a lot. Like, MicroBT is now using thermal paste or thermal greases instead of just thermal epoxy, which I think is, that's a huge improvement. But I think there's still a lot of improvement to be done on like heatsink geometry and ASIC dimensions. And I think that the cost of reusing those components, the savings of reusing those components, isn't nearly as much as the potential optimization of having more sophisticated geometries.
Yeah, we got to get there first.
So here's a question that came up in our last show that I'd love to pose to you guys, because we talked about it for a while. But one trend that we can kind of see coming is a move away from mining rigs to something more like a mining server rack or a wall, or something way bigger. Have you guys been looking at each individually, maybe looking at whether there is going to be an iteration in what an actual mining setup looks like, and have you seen anything interesting there? Kristy, I see you nodding your head. Maybe you want to jump in first.
It's very interesting to me that folks that were in the 2012 era might remember companies like Cloud Hashing or KNC Miner. They actually did produce Bitcoin servers. So, standard server racks full of Bitcoin ASICs. That used to be the form factor people adopted. And then we found out quite quickly that it wasn't really efficient. Part of the benefits of the ASIC form factor is that air pressure. So you can do some insane things with your data center and your CFD just because of the form factor of those ASIC devices. It is more efficient. And you can use all that air pressure to efficiently, cool your data center. The traditional server form factor doesn't work too well. Now, ASIC walls are pretty much the standard build nowadays. So, you see these 120-foot high or even higher walls where it's just ASICs stacked up and up, and you need a forklift, or not a forklift, sorry, a scissor lift to triage some of the top machines. That's like standard mining farm build out nowadays. There have been some companies that even today are experimenting with like immersion tanks for just Bitcoin ASICs. It can make sense if you're intending on never modifying or changing the ASIC for 2 to 3 years, sometimes 4. But most investors will want to change out their equipment. I've said Bitcoin many, many times. So yeah, that's definitely something. It's just interesting to me that in the original days, that was the standard form factor. We moved away from that for a reason.
Yeah, I think a big difference between the traditional data center that is structured that way, and I mean, it's intuitive for when ASICs became a blossoming business, that seems to be the intuitive path to think about. I think a big difference here is that the ASICs themselves are obviously commodity, and they're also a financial derivative of the Bitcoin itself. So I think the big trade-off here is obviously how much you spend upfront. The CapEx is a kosher word now, right?
Approved.
So, anyway, yeah. So I think it depends on who is spending this money, and I think up to this point, a lot of the data center, the people who spend a large amount of money on making the data centers highly efficient, these are not necessarily the people who are self-mining. These are people who are they're hosting, right? They're offering colocation services. The miners who are just mostly just purchasing the machines. So I think as as industrialization moves further, as more people own the data center and self-mine at the same time, I think the people then they have more incentive to invest upfront.
So the way that this has kind of been posed to me, and I'm learning while I'm listening to everybody, is that really there's an efficiency gain by having these rigs so small and so kind of compartmentalized to some extent. Why haven't we seen legacy data centers move to that same model? Is there something holding them back?
We have.
We have.
We actually have. Yeah, there's. So if you're deep in the HPC world, there's actually a few data centers that run cute little FPGA rigs in the same form factor now. Trust me, the world is looking at ASIC design. So whoever has a patent on that, if anyone does, they're going to be cashing in on some royalties. So Xilinx is actively exploring that form factor. I can throw that out there. And there's, I know Cirrus One has been also experimenting with that form factor. So folks are actively looking at it. It's great for, there's a hedge fund here in Bellevue that's actually been experimenting with shoving GPUs in that form factor because it is incredibly efficient and they can cram like 3 or 4 of those little shells with 2 to 3 GPUs each, and they can shove it into a closet versus having to get a rack in the office and then have the networking, and it's just not very efficient for them. So folks are looking into this. I think the advantage you really get from the ASIC form factor is the cost. An average chassis is going to run you, oh geez, Elsa would know better than I do, but like $25 to $30 like max for the best top of the line chassis at scale. And if you go into the server space, your chassis is going to end up running $120. So it's really cost. And oftentimes it's not like, the server can just provide more space for hardware. Most of the traditional HPC servers are kind of capped at 4 to 6 GPUs, unless they're specially made for 8 or 16, and then your costs start adding up. So folks are looking into that. I'm experimenting with it at my day job as well.
I think the point that you made earlier is also relevant in terms of airflow. I think that's one of the main advantages. Just the amount of static pressure that you can generate with the 38 millimeter fan form factor and that ability to direct that in an extruded aluminum tube is a lot better than in a large rectangular case where airflow is it's a lot more difficult to easily cool all the components in just the ratios they need to be. Part of the reason why that's so simple for an ASIC is that you just have this really consistent thermal load where every chip is just constantly outputting its wattage. Unlike traditional server where you've got multiple components that are ramping up and down and may have different differing airflow requirements, and you've got volatile memory and you've got long-term storage, and all of those have different temperature sensitivities. Versus ASIC chips, like those are just going to run hot, and as long as they have new airflow, you're good.
Yeah, I think that water cooling can solve this problem to make the ASIC miners to be more like a data center and more like a servers. Yeah. Actually, we are working on designing some water cooling system, and we want to design its the mining machines more like a server. And then that in the near future that you could to make it to that put in so the mining farm is more like a data center by using the water cooling system.
I remember talking to the Layer 1 guys, and they talked about how some manufacturers should just custom make chips for water cooling or immersion cooling systems. Is that something that WhatsMiner is doing?
I'm sorry, cut chips.
Is WhatsMiner making chips specially for immersion cooling setups?
Yeah. So the immersion cooling, there are in 2 ways. And one is some liquid oil, some special oil to the immersion, and the other way is the water cooling. So I know that there are many customers that are very interesting, like to fix the manners and adjust this into the immersion system cooling. So that would be really interesting, and also we see that potential. So we are if we're going to design a plan for all the customers, so maybe the water cooling is that we're working with. Yeah.
Just so I'm clear, water cooling is different than immersion in mineral oil, right?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I've never heard of an ASIC board that's water cooled. That would be crazy.
Yeah, I think we're gonna to launch some samples next month. Yeah, about the water cooling. Yeah.
Wow.
Never heard of water cooled either. I've only heard of like the immersion, like solvent stuff. You know, so
You
it's
can get
always
like
like some
water-cooled
patented
Yeah.
stuff.
for
Yeah,
gaming.
I watched your videos about Jesse, and he did the immersion system. That's really cool. Yeah, it's a hot. Yeah.
Yeah, Jesse, what do you have?
The hot
What do you
tub.
have to say about this?
My Bitcoin hot tub.
The hot
Yeah.
tub time machine.
Yeah.
I think that's the best use case for immersion cooling.
Yeah.
Was that water cooled?
I mean, well, it's directly immersion cooled. I mean, you could do I've thought about doing a water cooled one. The biggest thing, you just have to make a water block for it. Like water is a far better heat transfer fluid than oil. You're at, depending on the viscosity of your oil, you're at like a fifth the viscosity of your, your typical oil that you'd use for immersion cooling. And you're also at about 5 times the thermal conductivity as well as higher specific heat capacity. It's just a far better heat transfer fluid. But the thing is, like, for Bitcoin ASICs, it doesn't really matter that much. Like, we're not running at crazy heat densities with ASICs. Like you're running at much lower frequencies just for pure economic reasons. If like heat output isn't the limiting factor on where we're setting ASIC chip frequency.
So I want to kind of move on to talking about like what's the future of ASICs. Kristy had a thread kind of like talking about what could happen. I know lots of people have been rumoring like big players are coming to the ASIC space. It's not going to be startups running the show. Legacy chip makers are going to start making Bitcoin ASICs. Like, who has an opinion here? I feel like Leo may have some insight here that could be interesting. Leo, why don't you jump in here? What's the future of ASIC production, and are the big boys getting in?
Well, I mean, obviously, I don't have the insider information about the recent rumor of a major player coming in. I think everyone heard about that rumor, but I personally don't have a confirmation on that. I think it's inevitable for legacy players to start looking into this space, especially they already have a advantage in some tangent aspects. It's obvious from some of the previous experiments of some smaller startups that starting in an ASIC, especially a Bitcoin ASIC company from scratch, is incredibly difficult. Especially nowadays, you have to compete with, Bitmain, if Bitmain is still manufacturing machines, MicroBT on wafer allocation, especially as we move on to more advanced processes. This become much more capital intensive. So you really need investors who really are willing to bankroll you in order for a small startup to become successful. I think it's more common for startups to experiment with FPGA or just go straight for altcoin ASICs, but that's incredibly risky, and there's no guaranteed success there.
Anyone else have a scoop here?
I think it's just
Jesse.
a matter of market size. I think that once the market size is large enough and it's consistent enough, you're going to see bigger players hop in. I mean, there's so much skill set overlap. I wouldn't be surprised at all if you see larger players start to play a bigger role in ASIC manufacturing. But I don't know if that's actually going to change the. I mean, in terms of it could be helpful for sort of your large. I'm gonna have to drink for this, but institutions that are procuring ASICs to have more partners that have more of a name brand they're more familiar with. But I think in terms of ASICs, we're already seeing commoditization. We're already seeing competition. We're already seeing like payment terms today on a Bitcoin order look vastly different than they did a couple of years ago. And if you ordered ASICs in 2016 or 2017, it was you send a check or a wire and you hope that they show up. And that's a very different story today.
I think
just because you're.
Go ahead, Steve.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, I was thinking about like Intel. Like, didn't Intel recently outsource a lot of their chip manufacturing to TSMC? And if that's true, I think that's what I read. And if that's true, like, it just goes to show you, it doesn't really matter how big you are. It's how you use it. You know, like if you're a great product designer and you're a small outfit, I mean, you can still make it, right?
I think a trend, I have to be careful what I say here, so I'm choosing my words carefully. I think a trend you may start to see is that innovating on the actual silicon level, the chip itself, that's quite hard. And so MicroBT, as a great example, has managed to achieve something that no one else in the space can achieve. Even if, as an example, Global Foundries wanted to build a Bitcoin ASIC today, they would have to spend the 5 to 7 years of R&D and research effort to catch up on that innovation. And so what most companies will do strategically is instead they will try to do a joint venture where they will say, come, let us grab your technology, let's manufacture it, and use the supply chains of a Global Foundries to distribute worldwide. And so one of the capabilities I don't think people talk enough about is a company like Intel or TSMC or Global Foundries, they ship products worldwide. They have economies of scale that are unfathomable. And so if you're trying to build up your company to ship 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 ASICs per month, you eventually need to partner with someone who has already built out those supply chains. And I think that is the next wave of innovation we are going to see. There is very little you can keep doing on the chip level. I mean, there's some, optimizations you can squeeze out at process node, but it's a SHA-256D chip. We've done that song and dance for many years now. The innovation is all going to come at scaling up your operations.
So how does that fit in with what we were talking about earlier when we were saying that, a real fear is to see some big institution buy up a whole bunch of these rigs and just sit on them? I mean, it sounds like these are two competing forces right now, right?
Yeah, so if you eventually get to the point where you are scaled up in our hypothetical example by someone like a Global Foundries or like an Avnet or a Future Electronics, you will not have enough capital. Case in point, can some big business today buy up every single PS5? Can some big business buy up every single Nintendo Switch? Can some business buy up every single iPhone? No, it's just, that is an insane amount of money. There's too much scale. And why would you do that? I think once you partner with someone who can help you scale up aggressively like that, that is no longer a concern. It is a concern when it's still very, very small, when a company can only produce a few thousand to, 10,000 per month at best. And shipping times are 3 months? So a bigger corporation can ship weekly, daily even. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 9 months. I'm very excited.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think in the short term, it may be a concern, but I think for long-term players in Bitcoin mining, I don't think it's really a concern. I think that if you're looking at, am I procuring ASICs in the next 3 to 6 months, like that's always going to be a volatile time window. There's always a ton of people competing for a limited amount of already allocated fab space. But if you're looking at longer term procurement over the course of a year or further out, there's tons of flexibility in how you obtain that.
Interesting. And Kristy, you said a time scale of 9 months. I mean, that strikes me as like kind of a short time scale to look at in terms of seeing some major changes in the supply chain of
Not at
ASICs.
all.
No?
Not at all. Hardware moves incredibly fast. I don't think people realize how quickly you can turn around a hardware product. I mean, a mobile phone from start to finish, can be produced in 7 months. And then the rest is just, it's all marketing fluff and getting, polished in QA. An ASIC can be turned around in 6 to 9 months. If I've mentioned this before, so I can say it again. There have been, quite a lot of companies in 2017 really started looking into Bitcoin mining. So it's no secret that Intel was sniffing around. Intel now holds patents. Intel has a dedicated division researching Bitcoin mining. And GlobalFoundries the same. Now that it's all leaked, there's been plenty of mining farms that have partnered with GlobalFoundries to produce ASICs. TSMC, very, very well known in their North American division that, they've been partnering with miners. This is a thing everyone's looking at. Avnet used to produce one of the most efficient Bitcoin miners back in the day, the good old Spondoolies miner. They produce, the most efficient Dash miner. So big players are actively involved in this space. The biggest concern they had was the volatility. So when 2017 came around, there was this huge boom. Everyone was drooling over the sales volumes. And then 2018 hit, and where was the sales? Nothing. It was a complete lull. That volatility, it does not work well with hardware. Hardware is all about very, very tightly controlled timelines and prediction models. And so as businesses come into play in Bitcoin, Drat, it becomes much more predictable. So a larger farm, they might keep acquiring power, and they have a regular deployment schedule of they want to deploy 10 megawatts per month, as an example. They can work with their chosen hardware vendor to plan and allocate all of that out. As we start to get to that scale, things become a lot more easier. So I sadly am out of drink, so I will chug my water bottle.
Well, you have to, because you said Bitcoin. I heard it.
I did.
So here's another question, kind of along the same lines. When we talk about really big players getting into the space, one of the bigger players you can talk about is a country, right? There's a couple different threads I've been thinking about recently. One is, what countries will start mining, et cetera, et cetera. Second question, though, and feel free anyone to jump in and tackle either one of these, is what countries could we see really benefit from Bitcoin mining proportional to kind of their size currently in the global economy? I'm thinking things like, latitude, position, times, access to power. Do we see any of those really clear standout?
North Korea, man, obviously.
Go ahead, Steve. Sorry.
I was sort of semi-joking but semi-serious, like North Korea. Any country cut off from trade, Bitcoin mining, they can export their energy, and certainly Bitcoin itself, right? If you're cut off from the financial system, obviously, but yeah, no, didn't mean to cut you off. It's more of a.
I don't know if I necessarily agree with it. I see the incentive on that, like people who are cut off from the rest of the economy could benefit from having Bitcoin, but you still have an opportunity cost to electricity. And that opportunity cost, especially in a nation where you may not have a ton of development, can be really high. Like if you have scarce electricity and your opportunity cost is probably going to be at least 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So if you're looking at your cost there, I think in terms of investment, the countries that are going to have the most growth are the countries that are going to be able to take the longest position. So countries that can get the cheapest cost of power, that can invest in long-term infrastructure and can have longer time horizons for those investments, I think are the ones that are going to benefit. So I think these are going to be countries that have like free economies with players that have a long-term Bitcoin focus, people that have a long-term belief in Bitcoin. I think that this sort of speculative mining of like somebody who's going in to set up a little bit is not going to last in the long term. I think that that as mining becomes more competitive, you're going to have to make long-term investments. Obviously that's going to be cyclical. Like as you get expansionary phases in like big bull runs in Bitcoin price, everybody's going to just go plug into whatever they can. But in the long run, I think that it's going to be a necessary component of a Bitcoin mining operation for you to take this sort of longer position to really make long-term capital investments that I think speculative mining is going to get washed out.
What if, like, for example, along those lines, like Iran, they might get sanctioned. They're not allowed to ship their oil or export their oil. They start burning their oil to generate electricity and mine Bitcoin. Like, if they can't sell it and they're getting nothing for it, it creates like an arbitrage opportunity, right?
Yeah, I think if there are
add on to that, a place like Venezuela that has unlimited oil, basically, the problem with them is they're just so corrupt they can't get out of their own way. But like an individual, companies couldn't do it, but the government could definitely do it. But it just comes down to their level of corruption is just too crazy.
I mean, I think even in that case, though, you still got the problem of like you're competing in this sort of global market where maybe you have a cheaper electricity because you're cheaper cost of electricity because you have artificial constraints that don't allow you to export. But are they able to make those long-term investments? Like, are those is that the kind of country that's going to build a mining farm that can have machines run for 5 or 6 years, or are they just going to build something that's like speculative, thinking that they can get a high return in the short run? And I think that like speculative mining is going to get washed out as you see these bigger players keep jumping in.
Right, agreed. I'm just saying, I don't think that a corporation could do it. I think that the government could do it because they literally have free electricity from.
Well, I mean, even take that example of Venezuela, right? Like their electricity isn't free to produce. They still have a cost of production, and they still have opportunity cost as to what they could use that for. I mean, that's part of the reason you'll see like they don't like people setting up Bitcoin mines and running them. I mean, they'll go and seize Bitcoin mines from people.
100%. Yeah.
I think the areas where, and I mean, anybody feel free to disagree with me on this, but I think the places we're going to see the most growth are the places where you have enough geopolitical stability that you can capitalize, like you can make your capital investments on a 5 or a 10-year horizon instead of making that investment on a 2 or a 3-year horizon. If your cost of capital is coming from people that are only investing in very high risk capital on a 1 or 2 year basis, then you're never going to be competitive for the sort of scale and cost of electricity and operational scale that you get with a larger project that can invest on a 5-10 year horizon.
Jesse, I think you make a good point there, and just to play devil's advocate to it though, you mentioned that Venezuela doesn't like people running Bitcoin miners in the country and they seize them. But what do you think they're doing with those miners that they then seize?
Yeah, that's an absolutely good point. Unlike I've heard that this is just rumors that I've heard, but I've heard of people who've set up mining operations and they wait until it's all going and they've troubleshooted everything a couple of days after it starts operating, and then the government comes and seizes it. But I think what it shows is like why isn't the government going and doing that themselves? Well, they don't have the knowledge. They're not willing to make the capital investments around that. They're waiting for somebody else to do that, and they're acting opportunistically. But I think that if you start considering like, okay, now you're a government and you have to build your own mining farm, you have to hire on all the resources, you have to dedicate this portion of your electrical production to this. Now you're starting to, you're regardless of the fact that you're a government, you're still competing in this global economic system. You're still part of that same game theory. So unless you're a non-rational actor in terms of financial incentives, like if you have some other sort of motivation, unless you're in that bucket, you're still ultimately beholden to the same sorts of economic factors. You're still beholden to the cost of production of electricity. You're still beholden to your cost of capital. You're still beholden to your economies of scale. So I think there's some countries that I think a lot of these countries are going to see some amount of growth, but I think in the long term, it's going to be hard to beat a place that has very high geopolitical stability where you can make those long-term investments.
So I'm curious, and I'm gonna flip this. I'm gonna put Leo on the spot here. On the flip side of kind of this question is the what countries could you see disproportionately benefit from other people, you know, just taking their miners to that country? I mean, Iceland has been like kind of a good example of people wanting to mine Bitcoin there. Do you see other places in the world or other situations where, you know, bringing your miners there because of some external factor like it's cold really comes into play? And could you see a country really benefit from that?
America. I mean, it's obvious. It's an obvious example, right? I think this trend has been the benefit of moving to America is moving mining machines to America is becoming more and more beneficial. In order for North America to become a key player in the Bitcoin ecosystem, you need to control, to some extent, control part of the production. I think the building up a financial system up from the ground require to be very as close to the supply side as possible. I think it's just going to be very difficult to organize rest of the activities if every coin that you interact with is purchased from China. I think, but just to your real question, countries that would benefit from moving hash rate to that place, obviously places with stranded electricity, with stranded energy, that they benefit from having Bitcoin as a natural buyer of this otherwise local wasted energy. I think that the characteristic of Bitcoin is becoming more and more clear to people. The question is just which group is going to be the main, what type of group, whether it's businesses or the government function, is going to be the main people that's pushing this to happen. I think it sounds very obvious. Oh, this moving Bitcoin mining to location X is good for location X, but I think there's just all of us here know that there's so much nuanced decisions that are in the play.
I think you made a lot of great points there. I think the point on Bitcoin miners moving to areas that have otherwise stranded resources is great, and I think that there's a wonderful metric to determine what's the relative scarcity of different resources, and that's the price. So if areas have a very low electricity price, that means that they have excess electricity. Bitcoin miners are going to be incentivized to come in. I think the only exception to this is areas that subsidize their electricity. So if there are large government subsidies on electricity, it's basically the government, directly putting money into the pockets of Bitcoin miners, and people get upset with that. So I think that's why you saw, areas, especially areas where electricity is run by the government and not produced by private companies, you're going to see a lot of pushback in terms of Bitcoin mining. I think it's one of the unfortunate reasons why we don't see as much Bitcoin mining in places like Europe and Canada as we would hopefully see, based on their resources today. But and I think it's also why you see, even this happens in China, where there are subsidies in electricity and then they get stripped away for Bitcoin miners. And it's perfectly logical to see the reason why governments don't want to subsidize specifically an energy arbitrage.
So Jesse, are you saying that wind and solar energy projects, like they're going to stop subsidizing them because they start mining Bitcoin?
I think wind and solar subsidies are already running out in the US. I think that we've got a year or two left on the subsidy programs there. I think if you look at wind and solar in the United States, subsidies were a big part of getting that industry going, but there's a huge amount of growth projected even beyond the end of subsidies there. And that's because wind and solar now are at the point where they're just so much more competitive than alternative fuels. And the big drawback for them is obviously the intermittency, but that's not a problem for Bitcoin miners.
Yeah, I just want to follow up to Jesse's point. I think this is something we're seeing in China very, very recently as well. So there are the alternatives to Sichuan, Yunnan, these places where they benefit from the flood season are Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang. These places, they have a lot of coal, right? And this is a popular place for mining activities in China between November to April. basically the miners, they migrate to these regions after the flood season is done. And recently, and Elsa probably can talk about this better, there's a wide sweep action to remove subsidy to data centers that are providing energy specifically to what they call blockchain servers. So this is happening, and I think it does have a pretty substantial impact to the cost of production in those regions. So the question becomes, after this flood season ends in end of October, November, where these miners are going to go. Are they just going to suck up and take the cost, or are they going to move out of China? I think we're going to see some inquiries out of China very soon.
All right, guys. So I want to move to our next section. I call it the mempool. This section is more or less like kind of bring your own topic, or like user or panelist generated topics or talking points. I wanted to bring up the topic of mining as a form of sovereignty, and as a narrative for adopting mining as like a or pro mining stance as a nation state. I feel like we kind of talked about that a little bit. Not sure where you guys want to go with that. If you want to talk about that more deeply, I feel like that narrative is strong in the US. Obviously, the US is well suited for that. Are we going to see other countries just getting into Bitcoin mining as a form of sovereignty, or as a form of like maintaining a stake on the network? Like, how long is that going to take?
I don't think that countries are necessarily incentivized to build out mining operations just to have a portion of hash rate. I think that if you're thinking in terms of the whole network there, I mean, if you're not already competitive in terms of cost of production, I don't think it makes sense to subsidize Bitcoin mining just to be a small minority portion. I do think that it is important for that hash rate to be decentralized in a lot of different countries in order to get global buy-in, but I don't see there to be an incentive for a small country to subsidize its own Bitcoin mining just to have a 2% stake in the Bitcoin network. I don't think that that's enough for them to actually like prevent anything that they wouldn't want to happen. But it's also a significant cost to them. I think that you're going to see mining go to wherever it's most economically efficient, which is going to be determined by the cost of power, the scale of power available, and geopolitical stability.
Inability to source machines.
I think the ability to source machines thing is, I think that's only a short-term problem. Like that's only something that you see over the course of 3 to 6 months. In the long term, with enough capital and time, you can buy as much silicon as you want to. There's no limit to the amount that you can buy. It's just a matter of if you have enough money behind you and enough time to actually go ahead and procure that.
Yeah, so I'm specifically thinking about the tariff on Chinese semiconductor goods. Obviously, if Bitcoin continues to grow, there's definitely incentive to build the entire supply chain in the US, but that takes it's going to take a little bit of time. Obviously, there are a lot of miners in US that are able to have creative ways to circumvent that, but I mean, the tariff is there, and it's hurting some people for quite a period of time.
I think in the long term, I don't see that as that much of an issue either. Like the actual chips themselves aren't produced inside mainland China. You've got TSMC and Samsung that are fabbing the chips, and the actual integration process is a pretty small percentage of total cost. So even if you had to pay a cost premium on the integration, it'd be pretty small in terms of the total cost of the machine. So whether you're doing that cost premium in Malaysia or Thailand, or if you're doing that in the United States or Canada, like hardware integration of machines is something that there's a lot of companies that do that on from the enterprise space. And if you had enough of a market size to incentivize them to actually participate, there's no reason that they wouldn't come in and do that service for you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, I had a conversation with the Liu Zixi at MicroBT about 6 months ago, that you guys were at MicroBT, you guys are thinking about building a assembly line in US. I don't know if that's still part of the plan or that's being delayed.
Yeah, about assembly factories out of China, we're definitely working on it. I think maybe you'll see the good news maybe this year. Yeah, I think it's very soon. Yeah.
In Canada, of course.
Oh, come on, Texas guys.
Um, I keep hearing tariffs getting brought up. So I wasted like 5 months of my life researching that stuff in 2019, and tariffs aren't a big issue for miners anymore. Bitmain, produces most of their chips now in Malaysia. They do have, they have their two divisions. So like miners for the Chinese folks, it's assemblies will run in China. They're not too concerned about tariffs. And then anything else is either assembled in Korea, Malaysia, Taiwan, etc. So are tariffs still a big issue for everyone, or is it only really around the S9s? Because it doesn't seem to be an issue with the S19 Pros and some of the newer equipment.
Well, they just made that Malaysian factory. Like it went online like 9 months ago. And that's why so many of the S17s were shipped.
I mean, the world had to change, right? This wasn't just a problem that affected Bitcoin. Trump's tariff stuff affected everyone. So, NVIDIA had to change their entire assembly line. All of the server OEMs that serve all of the HPC servers had to quickly deviate. And, this was part of the plan. So one of the benefits we have with Bitcoin is that, good Lord, I have to drink so much. One of the benefits we have is, we're riding on the coattails of the bigger industries. So all of the assembly plants that are opening up, elsewhere, crypto gets to take advantage of all of that.
Yeah, totally agree. That's a commoditized business, so that the actual integration of hardware can be done by a ton of different companies in a lot of different countries. And there is some sort of time to make that specific to any specific product that they're integrating, but this is not by no means a complicated product versus what take like enterprise servers that have all sorts of different types of RAM and different types of storage and multiple GPUs and CPUs and custom board layouts. This is like you have a bunch of ASIC chips that are on a board, relatively simple in terms of the hardware integration process. So in terms of shifting supply chains outside, it's just a matter of, is there enough market demand in markets outside of China to make it worthwhile to set those up? And if so, that's going to happen. And this is another one of those things where it's, if you're looking on the short term of procuring ASICs and the next couple of months, those capacities may be constrained. Like if you need a ton of ASICs 3 months from now, there's only so much fab capacity in the short term, but in the long run, those are not fixed constraints. Those are not, or fixed supply constraints.
And how the tariffs really work is it's all about the percentage of equipment inside the ASIC, the percentage of the assembly and the percentage of the components that are actually China made. So if 80% of your ASIC is made in Malaysia, for example, but you did assembly in China, that's still fine. It's all about having a majority being outside of China. There's all these exclusions because, most of the plastics come from China. Most of traditional mining equipment comes from China. Most of the worldwide imported goods come from China. So there's all these different exclusions once you really dive into it. And for a while at Core Scientific, we explored, can you label a ASIC miner as a form of computing server so that you can get exclusions? And it turns out that yes, you can in some districts. So there's all sorts of interesting ways to bypass that. But I know it's a big issue for the S9s and a lot of the older silicon equipment. Just curious.
I had to send back like 1,000 miners because I had paid a DDP price and DHL called me and was like, we're not going to release these to you. You have to pay this much more. And I was like, I can't do that. So I think maybe that just soured it for me.
Yeah.
And I just
logistics. So your shipping agents and your logistics agents have gotten much smarter when it comes to ASIC equipment. There was an insane amount of value being left on the table, and people have caught up with it now. So it's definitely something to watch out. I see quite a few. The most recent one that was in the news was Genesis Mining failed to get the proper export licenses for all their Chinese equipment, and now they're being slapped with a giant bill. You know, the government logistics agents, whoever, they eventually catch up with you. So miners, please stop trying to circumvent it. It doesn't work ever. It never will.
I got some through, but I got hosed on a big one.
Anyone else, like, what do you guys want to talk about here? What would you want to talk about with this crew? We have a very diverse crew of people with different expertise here.
Mining pools.
Yeah, we haven't talked about mining pools at all. Kristy, what in particular?
I don't know. I was just suggesting a subject. Okay, so the rise of the North American mining pool. That seems to be a very big thing I see in the news. Why does a North American mining pool matter? What's people's opinions on that?
I think it's going to matter for institutions. I think that your big institutions are going to want to know who they're working with. I think some of them for that's going to mean KYC and with both all their suppliers as well as the mining pool. So I think the problem there is there a critical mass of hash rate in the US to get that sort of mining pool going? And I don't know if we're at that point yet.
Can they not
I think it's
KYC?
mostly narrative, but I agree with Jesse. Like, I think institutions probably find value in it. I could see like some of my clients maybe finding value in it, because they're publicly traded companies. They want to make sure, there's enough hair on Bitcoin. Like they want to make sure, like I've had a lot of our customers ask us like where we source our supply, right? To make sure, they're not, like the miners weren't stolen or something like that, right? So yeah, I think the narrative around the pools in North America might drive some investment into it, but I don't think there's really a need at all. But I know a lot of people would disagree with me on that.
Well, I mean,
for me, my strategy on mining has always been efficiency ever since I started taking it seriously. So probably 30% of my machines are Bitcoin miners, and that's split between MicroBT and Bitmain. But I see huge value in buying, like I got a bunch of the new silicon Ethereum miners. I don't touch any of the altcoins, so I put them on different pools. So like I'm experimenting with this pool called Mining Dutch right now that I auto convert everything to Bitcoin. I don't touch anything else. And it's remarkably more like my efficiency just through the roof, because that machine runs at like 850 watts. It's making 22 bucks a day basically. And I can't there's no ASIC Bitcoin miner that can compete with that. So I have a bunch of like my legacy stuff, the S9s they just run, or S17s and my micro BTs, but I really look to getting these altcoin miners, as shitty as that is. Some of them are so efficient, and if you get these large cap coins, like I'm not worried about it because I'm just auto converting to Bitcoin.
So I wanted to push back real quick as a not a institutional miner drink, but the way that I've always viewed pools is that really they're a proxy for trust. It's a way to somewhat not have to worry about the minutia of mining. Just devote your hash power to a group, and you'll trust that group will treat that hash power in a way that's beneficial to the network and therefore beneficial to you, right? So I see what you mean from like a broad perspective that having an American mining pool doesn't really necessarily matter that much, but from a different perspective of where do I want to devote my hash power? Is it to some group somewhere that maybe has nothing in the similar background to me versus someone in America? If I'm an American, it's this weird like where code meets the human element, and I think that's an interesting aspect of all of this. So I just wanted to push back a little bit on what you said. Any thoughts?
Well, I think it's important, like you're right, like a pool is basically generally a custodian and you're trusting them. Um, that's why like I would only point my hash power at a pool with a very strong reputation. And then of course, like Alex is saying, number one for me is like if some other pool had like some kind of subsidy they were pumping into their payouts and I was getting more money, I'd put it over there. So I don't know, like I think at least the narrative around like North American mining pools, at least most of them, when I hear people talk about it, they're usually talking about security, like about defending, decentralization and the risk of too much hash power. The biggest narrative, of course, is like in China. For different reasons, I don't see that being high risk. And I certainly wouldn't subsidize a North American pool just to get hash power in North America or just to have control in North America. I think really what matters at the end of the day is, at least for the decentralization narrative, is where the hardware is located. It doesn't matter that much where the pool is located. But
I agree with that. I think that hardware decentralization is way more important than the pool decentralization because there's very low switching costs to switch between pools. You can go and point your hardware to a different pool at any point, but if you have an area where all the hardware is concentrated, then you're open to geopolitical risk.
Yeah.
So how long until we start seeing real geopolitical action against miners? Like how long until it matters?
Well, I mean, it depends on like what you consider geopolitical action. I mean, look at like what happened in Washington State and a bunch of parts of Canada and Europe. Like, if you don't have to, it doesn't have to be like crazy, geopolitical regime in order for people to say like we don't want to subsidize the cost of electricity here and put restrictions on Bitcoin mining. I think that's a big part of the reason why we're focused on Texas specifically, is that you have this open market where electricity is not produced by the government, it's produced by private companies. So it's a very different dynamic and it's a very pro-energy place versus if you're going into a place where the government has a monopoly on energy, they only have so much to give out, and then you have some user that's using an excise amount. I mean, it's totally understandable why people look at that, and especially if they don't understand Bitcoin, then they want to reduce the amount of Bitcoin that's there.
So I have a question. So here, like we may see that there are lots of exchanges. They launch their own pools. So what do you think of it?
I'm surprised we haven't seen more pools launch exchanges. A pool seems to me as a natural, you're already a custodian as a mining pool. Mining pools, and I don't know which came first, probably exchanges, maybe Mt. Gox was first and then Slush Pool might have been the first pool, but I mean, they both came around the same time, but they're both naturally well positioned to do both. So I think it makes a lot of sense. I don't personally mine on any of these exchanges yet that do that. So I don't know, presumably they could actually have a value add if they're going to give, they could incentivize more hash power to their pool, right? By sharing some of the profits from the exchange with the miners. So I don't know. I think it's a very natural progression.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think the synergy between mining pool and the exchange is very clear, right? The exchange wants to capture more flow, a consistent flow from the miners, and the only people have consistent trading flow in this business is just the miners. And pool is already a place where the mining flow is being aggregated. So it's just a conversion problem. So converting, how do you effectively convert the mining flow into a trading flow? One obvious way is that, okay, the exchange is already making so much money, you can afford to charge less to the miners. And secondly, you can offer a lot of very interesting products. I think Huobi, I don't know if they are already doing this, but they're considering offering some kind of product where the miner basically sell a portion of their hash rate for the X number of days in the future and lock in the the amount that they sell for that period of time. Basically, a cloud mining contract sold to the exchange itself. The exchange is able to bear that kind of risk because of the deep reserve, and at the same time, they benefit from having locking that miner in that with them, right? So, and on the other hand, miner gets the benefit of the certainty of knowing that, okay, my X amount of hash rate for the next 2 weeks or longer is going to have a fixed amount of return. And at least my electricity is for this month is guaranteed. I think this verticalization is obvious, and also mining pool is a commodity, right? Every pool is more or less looking like the same these days, with the obvious exception of a KYC pool. But I doubt that's going to be popular unless it's required.
Yeah.
You think there's going to be any pools outside of the U.S. that are ever going to be KYC pools?
Well, I don't know about the Chinese pools.
Exactly.
I would doubt it.
So I've got a question that has been eating at me since I saw Jesse's ball and hot tub. But one thing that's been unexplored in terms of the increasing of the efficiency of miners is what to do with all of the exhaust. One of the things that miners create, it's not just Bitcoin, it's also hot air. And coming from a manufacturing background, hot air is actually a very valuable thing to be producing. So I'm curious, has anyone been looking at, is there anyone that you've seen that's looked at, what to do with this current inefficiency of emitting all this hot air from miners? And, do you guys have any speculative, interesting ideas of what that could be used for?
I'd like to put it in perspective too before you guys get into it. Cause for every ASIC you power, you have to generate that power somewhere, right? And the amount of heat generated and wasted in a power plant, it dwarfs pretty much, I think, for example, like a reciprocating engine, you get 25% of that energy is converted to electricity, and then the rest is heat. So we don't see, at least I'll just speak from the oil field perspective. We don't see, aside from you can reuse the heat in certain applications to heat your buildings. You can route the heat to keep things from freezing off. You can do a few things like that, like heat tracing and stuff like that. But most of the heat's wasted. No one's, at least heat recovery. And not to say there aren't, use cases, obviously, you see the guys doing greenhouses and stuff like that. But generally, waste heat is such a massive engineering problem. That's a holy grail. I don't know if anyone can find a great way to use ASIC waste heat, that would be rather amazing.
So Genesis Mining did some work on here, but first I will speak from Washington State. There are quite a few weed farms here that are using ASICs to dry out their weed, which I just found incredibly innovative. It just summarizes Washington State. Yeah, it summarizes Washington State so well. And you also have quite a few farms that do that up in Quebec. It's smaller operations, but it's a great use case. During my time at Core Scientific, we explored drying wood, drying different kinds of plants, vegetables, agriculture. Over in Kazakhstan, you see quite a few folks trying to use the heat to heat, districts or heat areas. Here in Washington State, there's also they call themselves a blockchain architecture company, and they actually build Bitcoin miners into your central heating. So the ASIC basically heats your home. A lot of miners, be they GPU or ASIC, are also using all of their waste energy to heat their home. I do that myself. So that's a big innovation. It's all small scale for now, yes, but it'll get bigger eventually. And then the big industrial cases. There's a great company that sort of serves as the example. They're called blockchain domes, and they they have an interesting form factor. They take an ASIC and they put it on top of a pipe, vertical, and the pipe is in the ground. And what they do is they pump heat into a greenhouse, and so they grow stuff with that. So they have, you know, they're public. They've got a lot of innovative research. I recommend looking them up. They're a pretty large scale producer of these greenhouses, as it were. I think because cryptocurrency has such a bad reputation with energy usage, there's much more of a research and a focus on researching alternate ways to use heat. And that's where some of these innovations have spanned out. So it's definitely an area that's actively being looked at. To Steve's point, I don't think you can utilize all of the heat that ASICs produce. There's too much excess heat. Usually you can just vent it off, or you can power a little windmill. Some farms do that. They put a little windmill right up above on the roof of their farms, but that's about it you can do with it, aside from some creative use cases.
So as someone who also, heats their apartment with Bitcoin miners and heats a hot tub with Bitcoin miners, I think there's some interesting sort of one-off of use cases for it. But like what you have to think about there is like, you have all of the headache of running a Bitcoin mine at the smallest of scale in order to recover the like smallest amount of economic value. Like you can't use cutting edge ASICs for any of these applications because your utilization factor is just super low. So you've got to use older generation ASICs for it to make any amount of sense at all. But you run into a number of issues. So you run into this OpEx problem of like, there are huge amounts of economies of scale going from a 30 megawatt farm to a 100 megawatt farm. So running a single ASIC is just, it's not worth anybody's time in terms of the amount of electrical arbitrage that you're going to be able to get out of it. I think in terms of industrial scale, you also see big problems. So like, it's a great thing if you can recover some heat and use it for something, but there's a coincidence of location problem where most of the time, the area where you need low grade heat is not the area where you're generating it. Like Steve made a great point about power plants. Power plants, depending on the technology, are going to be anywhere between 40 and 60% efficient. So approximately the equivalent amount of total energy that is shipped out of the power plant is being wasted as heat at a much higher grade of heat than you're going to generate with a Bitcoin ASIC. But there's
and higher temperatures too, which is the higher
exactly.
the temperature, the more useful it is. And that's why like, what's the temperature coming off like even like a new gen ASIC, like 60 degrees or?
So yeah, so Celsius, if you're talking about microBT could get up to 60, some of the other stuff doesn't even get up close to that high. So you're talking about very low grade heat in terms of like, it's barely enough to heat a hot water heater. The problem is at scale, if you're looking at like replacing resistive heaters, essentially the problem is that you've got a much higher capex for a Bitcoin setup than a resistive heater. The reason why people are using resistive heaters in the first place is because they're ultra low capex. If you're willing to spend more, there's a way more economically efficient thing to do, and that's to get a heat pump. So at the sorts of temperature differentials that you're looking for example, for Bitcoin mining, you've got maybe a 30C rise in temperature. So theoretically, your theoretical maximum coefficient of performance of a heat pump is about 10. So you can make significantly more economic value by replacing your heater with a heat pump that's running at a high utilization factor than by running everything on Bitcoin ASICs. So I think there's cool one-off use cases for it. I don't think we're going to see an industry where everybody has their central heating based on Bitcoin. I think that ultimately you get way better OpEx economies of scale going on a large mining farm, and that just your capacity factor, utilization factor on running a heating system is just not going to be high enough to ever make it worthwhile to use new generation ASICs.
So quick question though, but just to kind of contrast for a second, there seems to be a theme with like taking older miners and using them and like underclocking them. Like, is there a world where, an ASIC type future ASIC machine lasts for 10 plus years, you underclock it, it's just part of how your house manages heat and how your house manages electricity? Is that like a viable future? No, people are nodding no.
I think it's
like not 10 years, 5 years at best. I don't think anyone has, a PC that they keep for 5 years, for 10 years, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's a maintenance thing of like, just think of when you're running a mining farm of all the types of errors that can come up on an ASIC. And now imagine that's your central heating, right? So now if for whatever reason, you got some pool connection problem, or you've got, anything sort of goes down, now you've got your heating is broken and you've got to go troubleshoot that. And it's just for the amount of economic value that you can make. Like, think of, for example, on an S9, you're talking about potentially saving 2 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour on each kilowatt hour used. I mean, it's just not enough economic value to make it worthwhile. You're talking about something that might run for a few hours a day. Maybe you're making, like tens of dollars per year. Like it's just, if you have to go troubleshoot that one time, or you have to like have somebody, like, even if you're not the person that knows how to use Bitcoin, and now you've got to like hire somebody from, that's a specialist to come do a house visit to do that. One service visit is going to cost you more than that thing is going to ever make in its lifetime. So I think there are cool use cases, but I don't think that we're ever going to see a future where everything is just run on on ASIC mining.
It's too loud to run in your house too. Anyway,
you can fix that. I mean, you can put like you can change heatsink geometries. You can have different fans. You can have that's a good case for that's. I mean, that's why I did an immersion tank like for my hot tub. I think that that's a decent use case there, but ultimately any sort of heat recovery project is just like to be a cool project. There's not a ton of like economic value in doing that.
All right, guys. We're going past 2 hours now, and I know it's getting late for a lot of the folks on the East Coast. I think there's a good time to put in our last word. So this is kind of your chance to give any last shout out, any last thought you had about the conversation. This is kind of your time. Let's start with Leo. What is your last word, sir?
Yeah, I think this is a really fun conversation. I'm glad to be part of it. I think the mining industry itself is at a pretty interesting point. I think everything we discussed earlier, industrialization, financialization especially, is something I pay very close attention to. I think these are going to have very significant impact on the shape and the path of the industry and how people are going to do business. I think how people think about risk is evolving very quickly, and I think people need to really figure out what are the better ways to manage their cash flow and what aspects of risk they're really exposed to when operating a large mining operation. I think we're going to see a lot of new framework. Well, there hasn't really been any framework at all that comes out to address this. That basically make this a more, I don't want to say standardized, but more professional, more something that with a better theoretical framework. That's something I'm personally very excited about.
Awesome. Let's go to Elsa next.
Okay, and thank you very much to having conversation with you guys. And I think the current mining revenue is quite stable. I mean, according to the total hash rate of network, and also some relatively stable price for the Bitcoin. So I think it's a good time to mine. But I still find as there's a lot of newcomers just get involved with this mining industry. But I feel like since this is becoming a large scale, and so I see that many the mining farms and also manufacturers, they become the standardized operation and professional management. So I would suggest that newcomers to do much research about mining before they invest it. For example, like how to choose more efficient machines, and also what's the best location for mining, and also about the power costs. So that would be all they are all important for them. So yes, just do the enough research before you get involved in Bitcoin mining.
I think you might be on mute there.
I'm muted. Can you guys hear me?
You're good now.
All right, Alex, let's jump to you, sir.
Well, yeah, first off, I appreciate, you guys organizing this and letting me be a part of it. I'm certainly, I'm just a guy with a couple megawatts that loves Bitcoin. I mean, I don't have the expertise that all of you have. So I appreciate the opportunity to connect and to learn from you guys. And I hope we all stay in touch. If anyone ever needs any Bitcoin payment processing, ping me. I'll get you set up. No problem at OpenNode. It'd be my pleasure.
Awesome. We love OpenNode, and I love the dynamic you brought to the conversation. So thanks for being a part of it. Let's go to Kristy. Kristy, what is your last word? Thanks for jumping on.
I'm not sure what my last word is. This conversation was awesome. It always is. I am getting incredibly excited about Bitcoin mining. I've been doing this for a very long time, and this is this kind of stuff I dreamed about as a kid. Having a company come out and say they're going to put $100 million into Bitcoin mining, having big firms like Core Scientific come up. I'm just incredibly excited for the next 2 years. I'm excited about all the attention this space is getting. This is the kind of stuff we sat around and talked about in 2010. We dreamed of what would it look like if Bitcoin was globally adopted. We're starting to see, it as a payment adoption being globally adopted. We're starting to see mining scaling up as a global adoption. I'm very excited for the next 2 years, I have to say. I'm excited that I get to be a part of this adventure with you guys.
Let's go. Okay, let's go to Steve and then close it out with Jesse.
Well, yeah, likewise. It was great meeting you all and spending some time with you. One things I'm very optimistic about is I just continually see more and more projects sort of add credibility to this space. That was always like a challenge for like my company when I approached like oil producers, right? They didn't know what it was. It's like a fad, it's like, what is it? Like it's 2017, like what is this pump and dump thing, right? But the longer it persists and the more, people like yourselves that add credibility to it, I think that's very important. And then I think the other thing that's very important is price going up. If price goes up, we all profit. So let's pump it.
Pump it. Jesse.
Global adoption of Bitcoin depends on Western mining, and Texas is going to lead the way.
Alberta.
That was short and sweet.
We're a little Texas.
Gotta love it. Gotta love it. Well, thank you guys so much for hopping on. And as always, I'm Brand BTC. CK, do you want to take us home? Unmuted.
I can subscribe. Don't get drunk when you run a show.
Cheers,
all right.
everybody.
Peace.